you.
So I want to get started. We've got Dr. Beckelhimer with us today, and we've been trying for a while to touch bases, and this is something that Freddie has asked us to do, and I'm really glad that she did, because I've actually been to Cranberry Glades, and it's, if you haven't been there, it's beautiful. It's something to see. Dr. Beckelhimer is a new resident of Scott County, Kentucky, following his retirement as an educator at Marshall University in Huntington. He's a certified master naturalist and master gardener in West Virginia and Kentucky. He frequently presents gardening and nature topics to educational, social, and civic groups and enjoys field trips. He and his wife, leading field trips. He and his wife, Mary, hike, travel, and garden in their retirement when not spoiling their grandchildren. So sounds wonderful, and thank you for being here with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beckelhimer.
Hi, I'm happy to do this, although I don't consider myself an expert on the Cranberry Glades area. I would call myself more of an admirer. I've taken a lot of students up, and I'd like to share some of my enthusiasm and appreciation for the area that is so unique. It's unlike anywhere else, not just in the state, but just about anywhere else. In a lot of ways, I heard some discussion earlier of the Dolly Sods area. And in a lot of ways, it compares to Dolly Sods. Both are unique habitats, flora and fauna there that you won't find elsewhere in West Virginia, or mostly anywhere in the lower 48 in the United States, in the contiguous states. And Cranberry Glades is certainly accessible to all of us. And I am going to see if I can share a screen. Let me come over, and I've got some slides going, and I will tell you. Okay, let me come over to the share screen. Let's see. Okay, can you see the big screen says Cranberry Glades, not little thumbnails? Okay, very good. And I will tell you too, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you want to. The easiest way is just to hold down your space bar, and that will temporarily unmute yourself. Or if you can't get in and quickly want to do that, another easy thing you can do is to find the reactions button on your Zoom, and you can sort of wave. You seem a little, I don't know if you saw the hand come up in my picture there, but that's a way to sort of get my attention. If you have questions that could be answered sort of asynchronously, put them in the chat box, and we'll take a look at those toward the end. But feel free to just, interrupt and ask a question. I will tell you that I believe all of the photographs that are in the presentation are photographs I took. So if you have a question of, hey, what is that? Where did you take that? What time of year it was? Again, interject. The diagrams are not mine. I stole those. I mean, I obtained those from web sources. But I think all the photographs, even the one you're looking at right now, the background, it was a close-up of the boardwalk at Cranberry Glades when I was probably there with Cheryl and Rosanna a couple years ago, and also my email address. And Elizabeth, I don't know if you make slides available, but at the end of this, I could attach my slides and send them to you via email if you'd like.
That would be great, and I'd be happy to send those out to the group. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
So let's go ahead and get started. Again, please interrupt as you have questions, and just unmute. Cranberry Glades is between Richwood and Marlinton. It's in Pocahontas County, but not far from Nicholas County, Greenbrier County. It's on Route 39. It's about a 3-hour drive from the Marshall campus. And so if we look at this road map, you can see that it's going to be, let me find Richwood, sort of right in here, Richwood, Hillsborough area. And of course, the mountains, the ridge mountains tend to be in this sort of diagonal area over here. So it's in the eastern side of those mountains. It's about 3,500 feet above sea level. So, you know, you got a little elevation there. Around Huntington, we're 600-ish feet or so. And the area that is the Cranberry Glades, about 750 acres total. But there's 50,000 acres surrounding it in this cranberry wilderness. And then, of course, it's all part of national forest. So this is out in real nature. I have air quotes the glades for you because and we'll get to that on why it's called a glade, but isn't really a glade. It's really a bog area. Within the Cranberry Glades natural area, there are 5 distinct bogs, and we'll get into those in a bit and what makes them, how they were formed, their geology, their history. The largest one, surprisingly enough, is called Big Glade. Good name. Flag Glade, Long Glade. And then, of course, the smallest one, creatively enough, is Little Glade. Well, imagine that. And because of the altitude, it's subalpine. They have some serious winter up there. There are mountains surrounding it, and it's almost in a bowl area with some pretty serious mountains all around. And then you have this area between them that is the Cranberry Glades area. And it seems that those mountains just funnel cold air down into Cranberry Glades, and as well as moisture, that you have those sort of rain falls that are a result from elevation, that as the air blows up into the mountains, it rises and cools and drops out its moisture. It surprised me, and I think I may have learned this from Cheryl, that frost has occurred in Cranberry Glades every month of the calendar. There's not been a month that they haven't seen at least frost on one day. But if you go to the area, and I've spent a good bit of time in the Sitka, Ketchikan, Panhandle of Alaska, and Cranberry Glades reminds me a whole lot of southeastern Alaska, with the climate, with the vegetation, the rainfall. It is not much like most of West Virginia. As we mentioned, it's in the eastern foothills of this ridge area that the Blue Ridge are part of, the Appalachians. At Cranberry Glades itself, there is Pennsylvanian era rock, roughly 300 million years ago it was formed. And it kind of reminds me of the old joke. Whenever I see a term of so many 100 million years ago, that I was at a museum one time, and I was looking at some rock specimens and asked the guide, how old is this rock specimen? And he said, 300 million and 5 years old. And I said, well, how can you tell with that degree of precision that it's 300 million in 5 years? He said, all I know is when I started working here 5 years ago, they told me it was 300 million years old. So I kind of feel the same way. But transitioning just away from Cranberry Glades, it gets into the little older Mississippian rock. And they're both considered carboniferous rocks, but the Pennsylvanian is more the sandstone shale kind, and the Mississippian gets into some limestone and karst topography. And that's not far away, but that kind of gives you the view of what the geology looks like in the bedrock. And if we look here, and this is not a very good diagram, and this is one that I pulled from the web, you can see the mountain ranges here, and Cranberry Glades is going to be sort of in this area at the foothills just to the east of the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. And if we look here, you can see a little bit of the area that if we look at the geologic past of this, though you had this shallow inland sea and it was transitioning into land, and look, it's kind of about where Cranberry Glades is where that transitional zone occurred. And of course, at that time, the equator was there. If we take another look at where Cranberry Glades is, this area, the pink, is in this ridge and valley area and transitioning into this Piedmont. So again, Cranberry Glades is going to be somewhere in this area. So it's in a transitional area. Again, another view. And this gives us a kind of a neat view. This came from the Geologic and Economic Survey, but gives us a view of ages of rock. And again, here you can see that this is the Mississippian. Here's the Pennsylvanian. And Cranberry Glades is going to be somewhere right in here. And with this map, you can kind of see that we're not far from Webster, Nicholas, Greenbrier counties, right off of Route 39. And we're also not terribly far from the Eastern Continental Divide. Now, everything, Cranberry Glades is still on the eastern side of that Continental Divide, but we all know about the Continental Divide that goes along the ridge of the Rockies, but there is an Eastern Continental Divide that goes along, and everything to the east of that line goes into the Atlantic. And in our area, it tends to go into Chesapeake Bay area, not our area, but the part of the state part of West Virginia that is east of the Continental Divide would tend to funnel over toward Chesapeake Bay area, James, Potomac, Rappahannock, whatever. And then of course, everything to the west of this Eastern Continental Divide is going to drain ultimately to Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico. So we're not terribly far from this Eastern Continental Divide at Cranberry Glades. So that's just to give you a little context of where we are. And we know a little of the area from the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, and no, Bert, I was not around to witness that, contrary to popular opinion. Close. And this area was not glaciated, but it was influenced by the ice sheet that came through 12,000 years ago and was significantly cooled and was covered in tundra. Well, that's kind of important because a lot of the plants that are there to this day came there because of this tundra climate that existed 12,000 years ago. So when I said that you'll see plants there, not unlike plants you'll see in Alaska, it's really no surprise when you look at what the climate there might have been like thousands of years ago. The tundra area, low temperatures, short growing season, and of course, the tundra climate can either come about from the altitude or the latitude. If you can be near a pole. So, Cranberry is a bit of an anomaly. It's not really at all that high of altitude. I mean, it's 3,500 feet, and certainly not at a high latitude, not that much higher than we are in Huntington, West Virginia, but it is still very unique and has characteristics owing back to its ice age history. And if we look at a little more modern history, Cranberry Glades itself has really been mostly a wilderness area. The glades themselves really didn't have a lot of it. Timber. Um, they, they were cool, short growing season. Um, the soil wasn't great. It was very boggy, moist soil. So it wasn't tremendous for agriculture in the bogs themselves. Now out around, yes. People used it as a hunting area. It was great for game, but the undesirability for timbering, for agriculture, kind of saved its life because in 1974, it was made a national natural landmark, and measures have been taken to preserve the area, maintain the unique flavor of it, and the National Forest and other agencies have really done a lot to make it accessible to visitors while maintaining the wild nature, the wilderness of it. The area surrounding it has been logged. The mountains surrounding it, hemlock, spruce, and hardwoods, like American chestnut. Well, hemlock is pretty neat, but hemlock gives off a lot of acid, and the acid from the hemlock had an influence on Cranberry Glades, making the water very acidic. And of course, American chestnut, a little over 100 years ago, some things happened with American chestnut. It was the dominant tree in Eastern North America. It was said that, of course, this is what was said. It was said that a squirrel could climb an American chestnut tree near the Atlantic Ocean and go all the way to the Mississippi River without ever leaving the branches of an American chestnut tree. And within a very short time, American chestnuts were extirpated, nearly extinct. Measures are being taken to do some work with American chestnuts to get varieties that are resistant to the blight that started that came over into New York in North America and spread like wildfire, and killed the chestnut trees. And it killed them in kind of an interesting way, that it caused a growth that was at about the soil line, a little bit above the soil line. So it girdled those trees. And what made that interesting is that the chestnut roots, in many cases, still survive. And I've been to areas not far from Cranberry Glades in Greenbrier County where there are groves of chestnuts. And that's the good news. The bad news is that, and the chestnuts come up from the surviving roots. The bad news is that the chestnuts grow to be a few years old, and then the blight comes back and kills them down to the roots again. But there is hope that the American chestnuts are being crossbred to Chinese chestnuts, and you're getting some chestnut trees now that you can buy for your home that are like 1/16 a Chinese chestnut. Unfortunately, unlike annual plants, these things have a generation is much longer. It's not like you're getting a crop a year. It takes many years before you can get to the seed, and then to get from seed to grow again and to cross those. So there's hope for chestnuts. But what happened to chestnuts in around early years of the 1900s, first 2 decades of the 1900s, is happening to ash trees today. And on my property here, we had a couple hundred ash trees, had past tense, and we've had to cut all of them down. They're all dead from this time from an insect, an emerald ash borer, unlike the fungus that attacked American chestnuts. So a little background on some of the timber around it, and we'll touch on that a bit later. Geared locomotives really played a role in shaping the area around Cranberry. And to give you a little, just a little background, locomotives have been around for a long time, but with a typical locomotive, the locomotive you would see on, if you watch a John Wayne Western, every stroke of the cylinder of that locomotive resulted in one turn of the wheel. Okay, well, that was fine if you were in Kansas or Missouri or someplace like that where it's flat, but in West Virginia, not so much. The geared locomotives like Shea and Climax engines worked with almost like a transmission, that you would have several piston movements that resulted in one turn of the wheel. So it was like the train was being put into low gear, and that allowed the timber at steeper slopes to be harvested and then brought to streams where they could be transported very efficiently by being floated down mountain streams. Before geared locomotives, most of the timber that was harvested in the state tended to be in flat areas. Well, we don't have a lot of those in West Virginia, and areas that are near streams. So the late 1800s really caused a big movement to timber areas around cranberry glades. And of course, that had a huge impact on the glades themselves. While not being timbered, the areas all around them were timbered. When the logging practices of that time took place, there was a lot of runoff, and this siltation ran into streams, which ultimately ran into cranberry glades and other ponds, lakes around the area, and caused a lot of environmental damage. A lot of the native insects that fish feed on couldn't live as well in the silty water and the muddy water. The fish themselves didn't do as well. So it caused a great deal of environmental damage at that time. One of the things that was near Cranberry Glades over in Greenbrier County was the Meadow River Sawmill. And it's my understanding that this sawmill was the largest hardwood sawmill in the United States. And you can see, and then they harvested mostly American chestnut. Chestnut was the ideal wood. It was rot resistant. It was hard, yet could be worked with common woodworking tools, which made it kind of unique. A lot of woods were very hard, but they would dull your saws and planes and hand tools of the area. Chestnut was hard. It was great for furniture, for flooring. It was beautiful, finished, just gorgeous. But it was set up, and they got big. You'll see photographs, and I think I have one of chestnut trees that are 6, 8 feet in diameter. But in the early part of the 1900s, actually the 3/4 of the 1900s, this sawmill was in operation, making everything that you could make of from chestnut, because it was just so ideal and employed lots and lots of people. And these chestnut logs, as well as other logs, they weren't getting just chestnut, but that was the bread and butter. They also got hemlock and spruce and other woods that were around there, and brought it to this Meadow River sawmill. There were, until, I don't know, a dozen or so, maybe longer years ago, a few remnants of the sawmill, um, not far from Raynell, West Virginia, and Greenbrier County. Um, but I don't think there's anything remaining there now. In fact, I think there's a strip mall there now. But if you take a look, these are some photographs of areas at or around the Meadow River sawmill, and much of the timber came from the cranberry country. And in the lower right is one of those Shay locomotives. And in this illustration, you can see that it is not like the typical locomotive. Again, the pistons in a locomotive that we're familiar with tend to be here, and every movement of those pistons would result in one turn of the wheel. With this Shay locomotive, the pistons are here, and then they are geared, and they run these wheels. And again, look, you got more wheels turning too. So it's not just a wheel, but it's multiple wheels, giving you a lot of traction. And they also had reservoirs that they would put down sand, and that sand would go on the rails to give you more traction, so that it wasn't steel on steel. One of the areas, the closest town to Cranberry Glades, and I think it's probably the area that is Cranberry Glades address, if you will, is Richwood, West Virginia. And it didn't get its name by accident. It was very abundant in timber. And when I first went to the area in the early 1970s, Richwood was a very booming, affluent town. There was money there. Everyone had jobs. It was a thriving town. It would break your heart today. There's very little. If you walk down the streets of Richwood, the shops are all closed. There are a few arts studios that have opened up in storefronts. Hardly any jobs. It's sad what has happened to this area. There is still a lumber company there. I don't know the name of it, but the lumber company is still where it was, just off the Cherry River. And they got their business by making clothespins, broom handles, wooden dishes. And the clothespins they started out making were the ones in the slide, the illustration. But if you think about clothespins, first of all, today, how many people do you know who still use clothespins? Most folks use a dryer, don't have clothespins, and even those that do. In fact, right here, this is a clothespin that we bought when we got married 40 years ago. Clothespins don't wear out. Well, nobody's going to make a lot of money from the business I get buying clothespins. And furthermore, I would venture to guess that clothespins today are not made in the US, not made from wood, probably come from Asia. So clothespin business didn't do very well. Ditto for broom handles, that sort of thing. So the area really fell. When the timber industry fell, Richwood fell and is pretty much a ghost town. There's still some great reasons to go. Cranberry Glades is one of them, but it not been good. There has been mining. The geology I mentioned, is Pennsylvania, and there are areas surrounding Cranberry that have coal. Uh, a good bit of the area is protected. It's in a wilderness area, it's a national forest, that sort of thing. But a good bit of it is not and has been mined. Um, Historically, there was a mining company there, Saxman Coal, that had mines and coke ovens and supplied the industries and business, uh, tanneries, other things that needed energy. They would get it from the Sewell coal seam, the New River coal seam. But all of these things had a negative effect on Cranberry Glades and on the area as a whole. Uh, Production of coke. I could show you a picture, not from Cranberry Glades, but from up around Thomas, where there are some historic coke ovens, and the stream still has a pH there of close to stomach acid. You'll get out in that stream, the part of the Blackwater River, and your feet will tingle because of the acid leaching from the beehive coke ovens that are still in place there. Today, um, very little mining taking place there today. Um, on some more positive events, Richwood has some things. Um, the Feast of the Ramson, more popularly known as the Ramp Festival. My goodness, one of my best things about the COVID pandemic coming to an end is being able to go back to the Ramp Festival. It is just, there is a leek relative, an onion, garlic-like plant that doesn't do well in cultivation. It grows in areas like the areas surrounding Cranberry Glades, and residents of Richwood will go dig these ramps. And it has been said by my wife, among others, that when one eats ramps, you smell of ramps for days. Your breath smells of ramps, your body odor smells of ramps, everything smells of ramps. But if you go there, it's a fundraiser for a number of civic groups. It has always been held at Richwood High School. And 1,000 or more people will come to it. And it's an all-you-can-eat dinner of ramps, country beans, cornbread. People from the community make desserts. And it's just a fun thing. It's very folksy. If you ever get a chance to go, I strongly recommend Feast of the Ramps. You'll have a good time. And if you take your significant other, make sure both of you eat the ramps. So another neat thing that Richwood has, it has what is said to be the only unnavigable river that has a navy. And the Cherry River Navy has been in place since the 1930s, and notable admirals in the Navy have been Babe Ruth. Oh, and everyone who's in the Navy is an admiral. Babe Ruth, Gerald Ford, Herbert Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, and Steve Beckelhimer is an admiral in the Cherry River Navy. Also, I got my friend, if any of you know Dr. Seelinger over in College of Education, she's now an admiral in the Cherry River Navy. And if anybody's interested in getting a commission, I can hook you up. I have tried to convince my wife to call me Admiral, but she refers to me by other titles that aren't as polite. Some notable residents of Richwood that I want to mention, because these people played a role in Cranberry Glades. Jim Comstock, he and Ed Bach, if there's ever a people that the term raconteur or character applied to, it would be these two old guys. Jim was best known as a newspaper man, wrote the West Virginia Hillbilly. Um, just a very prolific writer. And he and Ed Buck, for whatever reason, befriended me. And when I would take classes, I would often take groups of students up to Cranberry Glades. And they would find out when I would be there somehow, I don't know, and they would come meet me and they would tell kids stories. And one of my favorite stories that Jim Comstock always told, and I think it held a lot of weight for university students, is that he said when he went to Marshall University, he was the first person from his family ever to go to college, probably ever graduate from high school, first person from their community to go to college. So his dad had no concept of what it was about. His dad drove him to the corner of 16th Street and 5th Avenue, borrowed a truck to drive him to Huntington, set him out at the corner of 16th Street, 5th Avenue, put his suitcase on the curb, shook his hand and said, "Goodbye, son. I'll see you in 4 years." Because he had no concept that, with college, you could come home at Christmas or summer. He envisioned it like a giant factory that you went in one end of it, and 4 years later, you popped out the other end in a robe and a mortarboard on your head. And so he would tell that to students, that because people at Marshall at that time, and that was quite a long time ago, took Jim in and helped him and advised him and enabled him to get a degree from Marshall University. His best friend, Ed Buck, was a high school biology teacher at Richwood High School and was truly an outdoorsman. Was hunted, fished, knew more about cranberry. He forgot more about Cranberry Glades than anybody I've ever known about has ever known. Ed was a relative, and I don't know the relationship, but he was a relative of Pearl S. Buck, who came from Hillsborough, which is not terribly far away from Cranberry Glades, a little bit to the east, over in Pocahontas County. If I can digress for a moment with the Great Richwood Panther hoax, these guys had this, like I said, they were raconteurs and characters. Back in the 1950s, there was a guy who was from Milton, West Virginia, a friend of theirs, who always held that mountain lions remained in West Virginia. He always said, "I know they have to be there." Well, officially, mountain lions haven't been seen in West Virginia since the early 1900s. They were gone over 50 years by the time the Great Panther hoax took place. And they were friends of theirs. And so they decided that they wanted to do something to make this old guy from Milton just sort of validate his claim. Somehow, Comstock, Buck, and a few others were able to buy a mountain lion from somewhere in the Southwest. I heard New Mexico, I don't know. But they bought this mountain lion and had it shipped in to Richwood, West Virginia. And they took this thing up to Kennison Mountain, one of the big mountains surrounding Cranberry Glades, and put it in this cage there. And the plan was that Ed Buck was going to go up and shoot it, and that was going to be publicized. Jim Comstock was going to run an article in it in the newspaper and validate the guy's claims that, yes, there are mountain lions still in West Virginia. Well, Ed rebelled and said, "I am not going to go up and stick the muzzle of my gun into a cage and kill a mountain lion. And he said, well, let's turn it loose and then you can put dogs on it and hunt it and kill it. And he said, do you understand the amount of damage a mountain lion can do in a short period of time? And they were just not going to do that. So they made up a story about the mountain lion being trapped and caged, and it was brought down into Richwood, and people were charged a small fee to go to charities to see this mountain lion that was caught near Cranberry Glades. I don't know how long it took after the Great Panther hoax before it was revealed to be a hoax, but that's the kind of characters that Cranberry Glades tended to spawn. Back to a little more science, away from tall tales. West Virginia really doesn't have much in the way of lakes. There are no natural lakes of consequence in the state. And you say, well, what about Somersville? What about Beach Fork? What about East Lynn? Well, these are impoundments. These are reservoirs. We occasionally will get an oxbow lake that will form, but they tend to come and go. And what will form an oxbow lake is that if you have a bend in a river, the river tends to go fast around the outside of the bend and slow around the inside of the bend, which causes erosion on the outside, deposition on the inside, which causes greater curvature. And then where it hairpins back, you get erosion and deposition, so that eventually this bend, this hairpin, gets cut off and you have a little oxbow lake form. And they can be unique in their own right, but this is about the only kind of lake that we have today in West Virginia. We're not like Minnesota or areas that have more natural lakes. We have had lakes in the past, but not today. In West Virginia, our climax vegetation, the vegetation that's in an area that is the way it is going to stay, it's the tip, it's the ultimate, is typically a deciduous hardwood forest. Typically, not always. If left to nature, then most places in West Virginia are going to end up a deciduous hardwood forest. Most, not all. Different parts of the world. I mean, if you're in Kansas, climax vegetation is going to be very different. If you're in North Dakota, climax very different. If you're in Tucson, very different. But in West Virginia, deciduous hardwood forest. If we look at a process called succession, things go from one stage to another. That if we have an area of bare rock in a forest, wherever, a forest can't start growing on that bare rock. It can't take hold. There's nothing for it to grow on. There has to be a series of changes. So some of the things that will show up on that bare rock are going to be bacteria, algae. And those bacteria and algae produce little bits of acid that maybe do a little work to degrade that rock. They, sort of mechanically, they're little cells in that rock, and they sort of pave the way for lichens and mosses. And these lichens and mosses have little structures that aren't exactly roots, but they're root-like little structures that can get down in and flake little particles, grains of sand, silt out of those rocks. And these pioneer species start to break this rock down and start the very beginnings of soil formation. It's going to be very high in minerals from the rock, but the bodies of the dead bacteria, the mosses, the lichens, the algae start to contribute some organic matter. After lots and lots of generations, small little annual plants, grasses, take root, now things really take off. That these grasses grow and die, and they add that organic material to that, allowing weedy plants, woody plants, shrubby plants to grow there. And when you have plants with true roots, those roots can get down in cracks in those rocks and start to break it down. Soil's still not great, still rocky. So you can get things like some pine trees, some evergreens that can tolerate this dry, rocky soil. And they have these really tough roots that can continue breaking this rock down. And it continues on to the climax community in our area of the deciduous hardwood trees. So this is sort of a diagram I got from Encyclopedia Britannica showing how the process occurs from the bare rocks, bacteria, algae, lichens, small plants, etc., all the way to our climax or top communities. We can also have abiotic factors, the freeze-thaw cycle. As we know around here, you're seeing some rock falls along highways because of the icing that we had a couple weeks ago. Of course, wind, running water, and animals can play a role. Reptiles and birds digging through there can help play a role in the succession and soil forming processes. Now let's come back to cranberry. We know a little what succession is. How's that going to take place in a lake? Cranberry is not a glade. It's a bog. A glade technically is a sunny or open spot in a forest. It's a meadow. It's a forest meadow. Bogs are wetlands. If you think about what you might have in Scotland, the peat bogs, or the bogs that you might have in Canada or Alaska. But Cranberry Glades was once a natural lake. And in fact, it kind of still is. Because this lake, again, we're going to go back 12,000 years ago, that these were natural mountain lakes, but over the course of tens of thousands of years, sediment from runoff filled these lakes with mud, or started to fill them. Mud came into there, and the lakes were shallowed out. This was very natural. This was occurring. Now, granted, it was sped up. Had timbering and mining been able to continue around Cranberry Glades unabated, it would have caused greater changes. But this was perfectly natural sedimentation that was occurring from runoff from the mountains. All kinds of things were carried in by running water from the mountains, by winds, by animals, and things thrived in there. And as they died, their little bodies went down to the bottom, decomposed, and added nutrients. But the nutrients were often down low, but the sunlight that fueled photosynthesis, that was up high in the lake. So a lot of the nutrients decomposed in very different ways than if they would have been up near oxygenated water at the top. And you hear stories of, people pulling logs up out of the Great Lakes that are extremely old, and the logs aren't rotten. They're down there where there's no oxygen and they're very cold. So some of those things are happening in this lake. There would be floating beds of sphagnum moss, and this is not much different than the moss that you might buy to put organic matter in your garden, in your raised beds. And these things tended to float. And when these moss float, floating mats, they tended to further shade that bottom. And the mat, things could grow in this mat on top, this floating mat, but there were reeds and grasses. If you think about a tree growing on this floating mat, I mean, imagine if you had an air mattress in your pool, that you could imagine that you could pile some soil on that air mattress and get grass to grow on that air mattress, or some weedy plants or something like that. But imagine getting a tree to grow on the air mattress with soil piled on it. Not going to do very well. Breeze comes along, tree goes over. So not many trees in the middle of Cranberry Glades. And all the time, the bog continues to fill with sediment and dead plants. The dead sphagnum moss, and that's what most of what was growing on Cranberry Glades, formed this thick organic peat moss. The edges, as they tended to fill, the edges of the pond, because you had more siltation, the edges got thinner and thinner, and the ponds got smaller and smaller. So here's just a really crude diagram and animation of what happens, that if you see the pond as it starts filling up and floating mats, and then ultimately, as it would fill, other things could start growing on this. This is a non-animated view that we can sort of walk through. Open pond, you have some emergent plants, and these start dying off. Now in Cranberry, we would have to start showing some sphagnum mats growing here. And you have siltation, and notice the silt gets thicker and thicker. And then ultimately, you would have a climax forest there. That hasn't happened at Cranberry Glades yet. It's kind of somewhere here, sort of between the 4th and 5th stage. So again, here's a different view. This shows the quaking floating mat. That's going to be kind of neat. You have non-floating sphagnum here, and then you have sphagnum growing out that is floating, shading that area. The quaking floating mat gets me to a topic I'm a little embarrassed about. When I first went to Cranberry Glades, it was not as protected as it is today, and you could walk out in Cranberry Glades. And of course, you were doing untold environmental damage, but this was early 70s. But you could walk out into the glades on this floating sphagnum mat and jump up and down, and you could see waves. And it looked like the soil quaked under your weight. Here are some views of the areas. These are photographs I've taken of Cranberry Glades. This is very typical of the middle of the glade, of those floating sphagnum mats. This is an area near an edge where a tree had grown, and there just wasn't enough anchoring to support it. There are areas within the glades where the glade is less deep, almost an island, if you will, where you can have some small trees appear. The communities there, you have the quaking bog, and we discussed why it is called the quaking bog. And the center of it is open bog, and kind of flip back, these areas are considered open bog. Around the bog, you have this drier area where you have some tall annuals and some perennials like hellebores and skunk cabbage. And I have some photos of skunk cabbage. Beyond that, you have a shrub forest where you have a rhododendron mountain laurel, some shrubby kinds of things, not as much trees. Um, and then you have the swamp forest where you have the trees. But the trees that grow there are very tolerant of wet feet, of saturated soils. You wouldn't typically find white oak there, but you would have things like hemlock that are okay with saturated soil. And then if you go further out, you get into the upland areas, into the mountain areas that are going to transition into your coniferous forest, your deciduous forest, so forth. So again, here are areas. This is a transition to some of the shrub forest. Again, another overturned tree. This is open bog. This is a snapshot I took. It was probably around June, not this past year, but a couple years ago, showing to the left side of the screen, you're getting into shrub forest and then open glade. And this is the boardwalk that we'll discuss briefly. There is a creek that runs through Cranberry Glades called Yew Creek, called that because of the yew shrub. There aren't as many yew shrubs as there once was. Yew has recently come into demand because of its alleged ability to be a treatment for some types of cancers. Within the glades, there's anaerobic, without oxygen, decomposition of sphagnum, and that lowers the pH of the water in Cranberry Glades, leading to the formation of this peat, much like you would have in Scotland. There's lots of sunlight there. It just doesn't reach the bottom of the glades. I want to share a few things from unique flora of Cranberry Glades. This was the reason I started going there, is it's just the conditions there are so unique. Two of the things, there are pitcher plants growing there. There are two carnivorous plants, and the pitcher plants use this liquid that's held within the leaves, and these sort of one-way hairs that insects will get in there and they fall into this. The soil, and I'll air quotes, the soil of Cranberry Glades is very nutrient poor, and these two plants can supplement their dietary needs from ingestion of insects. The first time I ever saw sundew, I was at Cranberry Glades. And as a kid, I was fascinated. I mean, what child isn't fascinated with carnivorous plants? And I guess I envisioned these little structures here with the tips of sticky liquid that trap their prey. I guess I envisioned them as trapping like raccoons and bears and things. Owing to my affection for horror movies as a child, and I have to say I was a little disappointed when I saw that these things are about as large as the nail on your pinky finger, and anything much larger than an ant would not be in too much danger. But they're really neat, and there are places at Cranberry Glades that you can see these things in abundance. Grass pink orchids are gorgeous. Late spring, early summer. And this was one that I was able to get a photo that was growing fairly close to the boardwalk. Many of them are growing off the boardwalk, and you really can't get a close-up. Cotton grass, very abundant, a little later in the year. Of course, sphagnum moss, that's the dominant plant you're going to have there, everywhere in Cranberry Glades. Of course, cranberries, you're going to have cranberries growing in Cranberry Glades. Skunk cabbage is a neat one. I first became acquainted with skunk cabbage in Alaska. and the rainforest areas of Alaska. And they get their name honestly. It has a real smell. I understand people eat them. I don't think I could get past the smell. Uh, Clintonias, hellebores, cranberry glades, some lichens, the British soldier lichens, Cladonia cristotella, uh, the reindeer mosses, Cladonia rangiferina, and others grow in abundance around cranberry glades. And they're one of the reasons they can do very well is the same as I mentioned with the carnivorous plants. The soil tends to be somewhat nutrient poor. Also, the orchids can do fairly well in the nutrient poor soil there. Fauna at cranberry glades, white-tailed deer, bear. I've never seen a bear in the cranberry glades area, the botanical area. However, I have seen bear sign on the boardwalk. In fact, most of the times I've gone, I have seen bear poo on the boardwalk, answering the age-old question, I might add. You can see, I've never seen a beaver there, but I have seen beaver sign. Um, lots and lots of birds, cedar waxwings at some of the ponds on Route 39. Birders come to see the crossbills, and they're actually most visible at the visitor center. Snakes and amphibians, and I took a shot of this old red-spotted newt, one of my last trips there, really beautiful. The glades today, it's a landmark. I don't know how many visitors come every year. Cheryl may be able to contribute that. Spring through fall. The boardwalk is very accessible. It's a half mile or so. Interpretive signage. There's fishing around there. Camping not far. Just a neat place to go. It's a 3-hour drive. I've got to mention one other thing, one of my last slides. The Rainbow family has met in the area several times since the 1970s. And the Rainbow family is, gosh, how shall I describe them? Old hippies, not unlike people who might come to Burning Man. And they come by the tens of thousands. And depending on who you ask, the impact, many people said, yeah, they were just fine. Besides running around naked. No, actually, they weren't naked. They were naked, running around unclothed for their week there. They really didn't do a whole lot. They camped and played music and did what people do. And it was notable because there was a murder there in 1980. 2 women attending the event were murdered, but it wasn't a murder. The people who were convicted of the murder were locals who were from Pocahontas County. So it just was an interesting thing. If you happened to be there during a Rainbow family gathering, it was interesting. The visitor center, if you go, I would encourage you to start your visit there. The rangers, the naturalists are so helpful. And there are interpretive displays at the visitor center. They have specimens of some of the plants and animals that you'll see, a number of books that you can purchase, clean restrooms. And in fact, if you are on your best behavior, you may be able to get the naturalist or a ranger to take a walk with you. It's worth making a stop there. The boardwalk is not at the visitor center, but it isn't far. You drive across the highway. There's a good parking area, no issues with parking. And you see giant sign, This sign, I think, is the one at the parking area that you'll see. The boardwalk, I believe it's 100% handicap accessible. Lots of interpretive signs along the way that will say, if you look here, you'll see sundew. This is a good place to see sundew, or pitcher plants, or here's an example of succession, that kind of walk you through your time at Cranberry. Cranberry is changing. It's been changing for 12,000 years. It will continue to change. Invasive plants make their way into the area despite our best efforts. Climate is changing. The forces of succession march on and will continue to convert the Cranberry Glades area to climax forest. If we all decide to meet there in another, I don't know, 12,000 years, we might see a very different habitat, very different communities of that area, because it's just part of natural succession. Some places you can go, sites that I used, the U.S. Forest Service site, the Mon National Forest, Cranberry Glades Nature Center, all are great sources of information if you want to do a little homework before you go. I don't know if you guys had a speaker on Clio. I don't know if you guys know anything about Clio, but it is a neat tool that is a place-based project. It's developed by a Marshall University history professor, that if you are, I use the app all the time. If we travel and we're out of town, and my wife is doing some shopping, I'll pull out the Clio app and I'll say, what's interesting here? And I might find a place where the original Clio was very focused on civil rights locations. So I might find a place where there was a protest in the 1960s at a restaurant that wasn't open to people of color. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we did have a speaker on Clio early in our program, maybe even the first year.
Great. Was it David Trowbridge?
I believe it was.
Great. Well, there is a Clio entry that David and I did a couple years ago on Cranberry Glades, and we tried to do sort of a walking tour. When David developed it, it was just sites. But we tried some experimenting on taking it beyond just a site to a walking tour. And we also tried some 360-degree photography. How well that turns out, we don't know. But there is a Clio location for that. So if you're familiar with Clio. So that's what I have. And if there are questions, comments, need me to go back to a slide?
I have a question. Sorry if I embarrass you, Cheryl. Oh. If you were, and I would never do it, to step off the boardwalk at the bog, what would happen?
Cheryl would put you in prison.
Oh, I know that. That was...
That's nicer than what I was going to say.
Is it soft or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
I think, well, it's more solid than apparently it was. Was that back when you were a kid that, or maybe in your 20s, that you stepped off and it actually moved?
Teenager. Yeah. We were out in the middle of a big glade.
Wow. No, well, there are, I don't know if Rosanna wants to chime in, but yeah, there are unfortunately several illegal paths that people have created. They probably started with, probably being bear trails, but then people see them and, they follow them and they've worn trails down to bare soil. And they, they don't sink. Those are more solid, but we don't go out in the middle to test any further than that. But it seems like right by the boardwalk, they're pretty solid. But I don't know. I've heard if you stand there for a while, you might start to sink. I never tried it.
Oh, wow.
And I just want to comment, this was wonderful. So much history. This was just wonderful.
You had a question.
Yeah, you mentioned the peat that it formed in the Cranberry Glades and Ireland and Scotland. And I went to Ireland a long time ago and they were harvesting that peat. Why haven't we done that?
Well, you could. I mean, the peat, again, if left for millions of years, would ultimately perhaps be coal. That's where our coal came from. But
And burn it.
because this is in a protected area, you wouldn't be allowed to go in and harvest the peat there. But I mean, it may well make good scotch from smoking the grain from the peat. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. I have a couple more questions if I could go ahead.
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned the mountain lions, and I have seen a wildcat in West Virginia. What's the difference?
Those are bobcats that tend to be, I mean, they're obviously bigger than a house cat, but but yeah, not mountain lions. I don't know the exact date, but I'm thinking 19 teens or 1920s. Were when the last bobcats were killed, or I'm sorry, mountain lions. And like many things, they were considered to be a nuisance, a threat. And if you saw one, it was shot on sight, and they were just extirpated from the state.
Yeah, okay, but appreciate it.
I think the one thing that would keep me from stepping off the boardwalk, first I wouldn't do it, but when we were there, we saw a snake. But it
Yeah.
went, I don't know if it'd been up on the boardwalk. We were with a naturalist, thankfully, but the snake like went down into the bog, and he said that
Yeah.
the snake is more afraid of us than we are of it. So is it snaky up there?
Yeah. I mean, there are snakes, but again, most of the time when you're
It was a
there,
black snake, I think.
yeah, black snakes and some water snakes. If you would get up into the mountain areas, there are venomous snakes. This is just me, Cheryl. You probably seen. I have never seen a venomous snake in the botanical area. Cheryl?
I have not.
Like I said, he darted away into the bog away from us. So yay.
Yeah.
But if you haven't been there, it's beautiful. It's really something to see.
I would like to make one more comment before I log off.
Sure.
I'm sorry that I thought it was
Oh.
Dolly so much, but
Well, because I sent that out originally because I got confused, and thankfully Freddie set me straight.
I love Steve Beckelhimer and his family, and I'm very thankful to do this for us. And I want to tell him that Amy Varnum would be very proud of him, and he will get.
But
She's spinning in her grave right now.
oh no, she'd be very proud.
Betsy, did I see you have a question?
Yes,
Did you have
I do.
Yes.
Back when I was in high school, I went to Cranberry Bog that's actually in Buckeye Lake outside of Newark, Ohio. And I'm
Oh.
wondering if that still exists or if you've ever done any checking out of that.
I don't know, but I will, because I love Newark, because they have, again, it's a great place to go. It's one of those gas tank getaways that we do. They have a mound of a pre-Columbian culture that is a circular mound. That's really neat. There are areas nearby where the natives would get flint. So it's a neat area. I've never been to the bog, but you know what? Next time I go there, I will go to that bog. I'll look it up.
I'm just wondering if it still exists. It actually floated around in the lake, but it was having the issue of the trees on the outside falling in. So it was kind of disappearing. So we said,
Oh,
and this was back in the 70s. So I
I
just
don't
was
know.
curious if you knew anything about that.
I don't, but I will.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Any other
Thank you,
questions?
Steve.
Well, thank you. It's so good seeing you. I recognize so many faces there. I thought I would.
Hi to your girls.
Will do. Thank you.